Welcome back, everybody, to the Aurora Show. And I'm going to be talking about the retrogrades from the fall of 2026 to 2027. And so you can save this video, reference it down the line. But we do have quite a lot of retrogrades that are going to be going on through the end of 2026 and into 2027. And as I've mentioned before, obviously first contact summer, so much energy within that. August has the eclipse season. And so the summer energy is really, really intense. And then when we get into the fall, we immediately hit a Venus retrograde in Scorpio. And I had been saying all year in terms of the transits that it's going to be a huge integration time. But I find it super interesting just how many retrogrades we have going on, and then leading us into 2027, which, in February we have the incarnation cross change, which will be on February 23rd into the new incarnation cross that will last over 400 years. And of course, we will also have the Chinese New Year, which occurs in February as well. And we will enter a new zodiacal year, and we will also enter the numerology 2 year. So this year, 2026, right, has been, there is so much kind of energy to it. And there was so much, I guess you could say, new beginnings, fresh start, right? But a lot of times, when we're beginning something new, and 2026 was definitely the beginning of what we call the transition, right, into the new paradigm. It's a 1 year, it's a fire horse year. We have had back to back rarefied astrological transits, okay? And so when that happens, there is always chaos at the beginning of anything new. And so, of course, 2026 has been a roller coaster ride, but we are literally just beginning. We are beginning the transition. We are beginning the process. And it's always hard at the beginning. And I think with all these retrogrades that are happening at the end of 2026, like currently, right, we're at the end of July as I'm filming this. Already we have Saturn retrograde in Aries. We have Pluto retrograde in Aquarius. And so we're already we just ended a horrific Mercury retrograde. So we already have a good amount of retrogrades happening. But let's talk about what this retrograde season is going to do. And I'm specifically focusing here in talking about this Venus, Mercury, and Mars. Okay. And the reason I'm just going to focus on those planets in particular are because the outer planets, right, like Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, they go retrograde for a large chunk of time. Okay, so Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, these are going retrograde for 4 to 5 months out of the year. Okay, Saturn and Jupiter are going to be more 4 months-ish. And so that's a natural part of our process, okay? Those outer planets, those bigger planets, we go through retrogrades with them every year for a good chunk of the year, okay? The inner planets, because the sun and moon don't go retrograde, okay? The luminaries don't retrograde. Venus and Mars, we don't have Mars retrogrades every year. We have them every 2 years, okay? Similar with Venus. And Mercury, we get the most retrogrades with. Mercury does retrograde about 3 times a year. Sometimes it's 4, but it's for much shorter periods of time. So I feel these retrogrades are a lot more influential on us. Again, because these outer planets have longer retrogrades and they happen every year, it's more organic in terms of how we move through those processes. But these retrogrades, Venus, Mars, and Mercury, have a huge impact on us. Like I said, because Mercury goes 3-ish to 4 times a year. We know the lore about Mercury retrogrades. They are not the easiest times, okay? And especially because Venus and Mars don't go retrograde every year. It's even more influential when those happen. So let's talk about September. So we're going to get through August, which is the month of the solar flash energy. It is also our final eclipse season of the year. I will say lots of things about August, but let's get into September, which is where the retrogrades really kick off. So on September 10th, we have Venus entering Scorpio. Now, again, we can mark our calendars for this. This is going to be a deeply integrative time, okay? Because around this same time in September, I believe it's September 19th, Chiron is going to go back into the critical degrees of Aries. Now, if you remember, we had Chiron move into Taurus on June 19th. Okay, he's doing a brief dip into Taurus, and then he's going to retrograde back into the critical degrees of Aries on September 19th. Okay, and he's not going to re-enter Taurus in a permanent way for 7 years until I think it's April of 2027. So September, I'm making note of this because after having our first dipping of the toe, right, into Chiron and Taurus for a 4-month window, we then are faced with Venus, who is the ruler of Taurus, okay, dip into Scorpio, which is the sister sign of Taurus, the opposing sign. Okay, so the ruler of Taurus, where Chiron is for 4 months, is going to go into its opposition sign and do a retrograde there, okay? That's why I always say nothing is by accident, okay? The cosmos don't do anything accidentally. I think all of the themes that, again, astrology is often hindsight, okay? Hindsight is 20/20. It's often when we complete a transit, or like for instance with Chiron, we get a 4-month preview and then we go back to finalize Chiron and Aries. It's normally in the hindsight that we really understand what the transit was bringing up for us, right? Because we then see the contrast. Like, I've talked a lot about Uranus exiting Taurus, and I was like, hey, the story of Taurus isn't done. Like, we might be like, oh, we're free and clear finally of, this instability and inflation and this discussion about resources. Well, we're not done, because Chiron's going to officially go into Taurus in 2027 and Saturn's going to go into Taurus in 2028. So the story isn't done. But again, now that Uranus is in Gemini, I think we can look back and really see what Uranus and Taurus was trying to teach us. So this is going to be a similar thing. So Venus entering Scorpio is going to be a huge, deeply integrative cycle that is going to show us a lot, I believe, on what the Chiron and Taurus dip was trying to show us, okay? Because Chiron and Taurus is all about wounds of the body. On a more existential level, this is the wounds around worth, okay? And when we're talking about Taurus and Scorpio, Taurus is the tangible. It's the physical body. It's the physical resources, right? Like this notebook, I can touch it. I can hold it. It's Taurus, right? Money, resources, food, stability, shelter, the things that we can hold and touch and obtain, that is Taurus. However, Scorpio is the emotions and the capacity to hold those things, okay? Like an example, Taurus, right, can be physical possessions and money, right? Wealth, prosperity, abundance. But Scorpio is about loss, okay? Scorpio can be about debt. It can be bankruptcy, okay? So that axis is all about our relationship to resources, abundance, and prosperity, And also, do we have the capacity to let go of it? Do we have the capacity? How do we move through moments of loss? How do we move through moments of perceived scarcity, right? The relationship between abundance and debt, right? Scorpio can also rule inheritances, right? So it can be the thing of like, you know, we want to have stability, and we want to have resources, and we want to have tangible assets. But oftentimes that might come through actual death, right? Scorpio in the 8th house can also represent things like divorce, okay? What happens in a divorce? You have to divvy up the assets. You have to determine, let's say if one spouse was a stay-at-home, right? Whether that was the wife or the husband, maybe one was a stay-at-home. They put in the invisible labor into maybe raising the children or taking care of the home, or et cetera, et cetera. And so with Scorpio, you have to decide, what is that labor worth energetically? How do we split this up? So this is the axis of Taurus and Scorpio. So I believe that the wounds we're experiencing with Chiron and Taurus right now have a lot to do with our worth, and also what is the value of anything. And when we get to Venus and Scorpio on September 10th, Venus ruling Taurus and bringing in those awarenesses around how we share resources with others, how we give and receive in relationships, what we value, it goes through a death and rebirth process. And now this isn't to say like, oh, all of a sudden we're going to experience all this loss, or it could very much be the other way around. What I think it's going to teach us is that we have to have the emotional capacity to understand value. And I think we also have to have the emotional capacity to understand that nothing is permanent. Taurus wants permanency. Scorpio understands that nothing in life is permanent. And so it's this combination of almost, I think, looking at the beauty of the cycles of loss and gain, of the cycles of stability and instability, right? Of the cycles of prosperity and abundance, and sometimes the cycles of contraction, and maybe coming into more of a wholeness with this and looking at the beauty of all things, right? Because sometimes when we release things, when we let go of things, when we quote unquote lose something, we inevitably also gain something, right? And maybe we explore the deeper psychological beliefs that we have about money, about what abundance means, about what prosperity is, about what an asset is, right? So very interesting. So September 10th, Venus enters Scorpio. Now on September 30th, and at this time again, Chiron will be back in Aries. So Mercury will enter Scorpio. Okay, so a very scorpionic September. And again, this is interesting because it's Libra season. Okay, but there's going to be a heavy scorpionic tone to the Libra season. Okay, so we might not get the, I obviously love Libra season because it's my solar return, but it may not be as, I'm not saying it's not going to be, I love Libra season because it's whimsical. People just tend to have this ease. Everybody wants to kind of gather and enjoy. Like the fall time is just like, I think it's the best time of the year. But there's a scorpionic undertone here. So as we move into October, okay, October 3rd, Venus begins her retrograde in Scorpio. So we will basically have about 3 weeks of Venus transiting through Scorpio. She's going to get to the later degrees of Scorpio, and then she's going to retrograde starting October 3rd. Okay, so all of October, we will be deep in some sort of reevaluation around our relationship to worth, to loss, what is an asset, what is the value of things. Do we have the emotional and psychological capacity to move with the rhythms of life, right? We might also, I think, see people in the world, right? Maybe who are constantly hoarding wealth, prosperity, assets. Maybe people who have had control over the resources suddenly lose it. This could also mean that those who have the capacity to receive, and they have done that work with their nervous system, with their belief systems, right, with their self-autonomy, actually receive what they have been owed, if you will. So this could be a really interesting October. Now, okay, October 3rd. Now we get to October 24th. Mercury goes retrograde in Scorpio. Okay, so for all of September, almost all of September, we've got Venus in Scorpio. September 30th, Mercury enters. So all of October, we have Venus in Scorpio and Mercury in Scorpio. Okay, and at the end of October, Mercury goes retrograde. So it's dicey, right? It gets really interesting. So we have to ask ourselves, right? I talked about this earlier, I think in a previous video, but looking at the Mercury retrogrades of this year, because typically the Mercury retrogrades do follow a pattern. Not all the time, but sometimes, often, all the Mercury retrogrades of a year might happen in the same element, okay? 2026 is one of those, okay? We had a Mercury retrograde in March during eclipse season. It was horrific. It was in Pisces, okay? We didn't have a good time. Again, I've talked extensively about why Mercury doesn't always love being in water signs, because there's a lot of friction with the way Mercury typically operates and the archetype of Mercury. When it's in water signs, the element of water doesn't work the way Mercury works, okay? Water is intuitive. It's about feeling. It's about depth, okay? It's more of an emotional communication. It's more of an abstract feeling, sensing, and intuiting type of element. And Mercury is factual. Mercury wants clarity, precision, communication, facts. Doesn't always have a great mix to it, okay? All of July, Mercury was retrograde in Cancer, another water sign. We did not have a good time, okay? Again, I go back and forth sometimes, where I always want to be optimistic about things, because the way we perceive something, right, and our expectations of it and the way we perceive things often has an effect on the way we experience it, right? So I don't want to be like, oh my God, it's going to be terrible, it's going to suck, we should all prepare for it. But I'm also painfully realistic in that you could be like, oh, this is going to be fantastic, and it's not, right? And so I think the moral of the story is, don't have any expectations, because often reality is going to do what reality is going to do. And instead of having expectations which lead to disappointment, we should just be open to what it brings. But nonetheless, I feel like, just looking at the pattern, it's going to be quite intense. But Mercury retrograde in Scorpio, joining the party of Venus retrograde in Scorpio, tells me that this is a conjunction happening, right? So we're not only diving into, again, kind of the deeper emotional blocks, if you will, to receiving. Maybe there's these deep wounds around money, around stability, around loss. Maybe we go through a bit of a grief of something, right? That's the Venus. Mercury retrograde in Scorpio, I think, is going to take us down the path of really looking at our psychological beliefs, the way we're thinking about things, and really uncover how we might be our own worst enemy here, right? The way we're thinking and our psychological and blocks and our thought patterns, right, could actually be the biggest problem. And so I think Venus and Mercury are going to work together to excavate what needs to go. Because again, moving into next year, the 2 is such a beautiful year. It's always about union and connection. Things start to really come into form in a 2 year. After the 1 year, it's going to be the year of the ox, which is representative of prosperity. Chiron will re-enter. New incarnation cross change. So there's a lot to unpack here. And so it's very interesting that in this fall time, Mercury and Venus will be together retrograde in Scorpio. Okay. Now, when we hit the end of October 25th, Venus is actually going to retrograde back into Libra. So for my Libras, we will also be affected by this retrograde. And Venus in Libra, I think, is a review. Because with Scorpio, we're diving into maybe our blocks of worth in vulnerability and being open to receiving, right? And how we process life, right? And how we hold on to things where we might need to let go. And then the Venus in Libra part of the retrograde is a deep dive into reviewing any relationships or any relationship you have with yourself or to people, places, and things that are not reciprocous. Okay, so there's the reciprocity isn't there, right? And so I think we're going through a deeply transformative time where we're really going to know what we're worth and what we value, and we're no longer going to participate in dynamics that don't support that, right? Now, when we get to November 13th, okay, Mercury and Venus go direct on the same day. Also find that interesting. So Mercury is going to go direct in Scorpio and Venus will go direct in Libra. Okay, ending the retrograde period of the fall. So I think, again, there's going to be clarity on our belief systems, our thought patterns, deeply kind of integrative time, and then also a very kind of beautiful time to focus on the relationships that are making our lives better, right? Relationships and environments and things that are actually adding to our life and not taking away from it. And so this could be a good celebration time. However, then we get to November 25th, okay? Mars is going to enter Virgo. Now, this becomes important later because Mars is going to go retrograde in Virgo. So once we start the end of November, Mars goes into Virgo, and suddenly we want to clean up our lives. Again, this deeply regenerative, deeply healing, deeply excavating retrograde season with Venus, Scorpio and Libra, and Mercury and Scorpio then leads us to Mars and Virgo, which is going to make us want to now purge our lives, cleanse our lives, put all the pieces into place. We now are in a new frequency. And now we want to correct everything that doesn't match that. We want to purge. We want to simplify. We're probably going to do some physical cleansing and healing during that time as well. And then we get to December 4th. Venus re-enters Scorpio. So basically for like 4 months, we're going to have an influence of Venus in Scorpio. Okay. It doesn't quite let up. And then December 6th, Mercury finally exits Scorpio and goes into Sagittarius. Suddenly the mental load is lightened. Suddenly there is some optimism. There is a bit more, we're kind of coming out from, under the depths of the water, and we feel like we want to breathe. We feel like we're ready to expand. I'm looking forward to that Mercury entering Sagittarius there. Okay, now all of December, Venus will be in Scorpio. Okay, so it'll be in Scorpio during holiday season. This could make for some very interesting family dynamics. This could make for a very interesting consumer season. I'm very interested to see if this affects the consumerism around Christmas time, where people just aren't buying into it anymore. They don't care, right? Because there's a total restructuring here of what we value. So to me, I feel like with Mars in Virgo, which is very practical, very much about purging, minimalism, maybe we finally realize that prosperity is not necessarily always about more. Maybe it's about less, right? Like maybe the season really becomes about giving and not buying in that way. Maybe Mercury and Sagittarius unites us all to really focus on the art of gathering, the art of joy, the art of celebration without the strange consumerism culture. I don't know, could be interesting, right? But this leads us into January. Okay, January 7th, Venus enters Sagittarius. Okay, so starting from September 10th, October, November, December, January, we finally have Venus exiting Scorpio. So actually, funny enough, January might feel a bit more celebratory than the holiday time, simply because Venus is retrograde, and Venus in Scorpio is, like I said, much more internal, regenerative, deeply healing, and also deeply mystical process. January is going to carry the Sagittarius energy, which is very different from how our usual setup is. Okay, now January 10th, Mars begins his retrograde. So after months of dealing with a Venus retrograde in Scorpio, Mercury retrograde in Scorpio, we now have a Mars retrograde in Virgo. Okay, and the difference here is that when Mars goes retrograde, Mars is our action. Mars is our momentum. It's the way we execute. It's how we move forward in life. It's our energy levels. So usually during any Mars retrograde, our energy levels can dip a little bit because we're kind of pulled to slow down. But it also depends on the sign, right? So Mars retrograde in Virgo, I feel, is then going to pull the energy internal. Okay, so we might have spent, a month really, again, purge. I'm just getting the visual of purging, minimalism, cleansing, releasing, getting everything in order, and really just feeling like we have space. We have excavated the inside and we might excavate the outside. Now Mars retrograde is going to pull that energy internal, and I do feel we're going to go through an internal sorting process again. Again, this also might be a good time to reflect on things, to maybe redo some things. It also could lead to a real push for focusing on health and wellness again. This is going to be, a theme that follows us into the future here. February 9th. February 9th, Mercury goes retrograde in Pisces. So we will have another Mercury retrograde in Pisces next year. Painful, I know. And remember, Pisces and Virgo are opposite. So Mercury in Pisces is in its fall, okay? Out of all the water signs, it does worst in Pisces because it's in fall. It does not operate well. We get lost. There's confusion. We're not totally sure what's happening, okay? It can literally just be like we're living in the Truman Show and our reality is just like a movie, and we're all like, that's how Mercury retrograde in Pisces feels to me. No one's making sense. We're speaking different languages. And then you have Mars retrograde in Virgo on the opposing axis, wanting us to correct things, redo things, find clarity, right? Find where things need to be redone and fixed, maybe purging internally. I am a little slightly concerned about the February retrogrades here. And again, that is the month that the incarnation crosses change. So we will cross that bridge when we get there, but I just like us to be prepared for what we're walking into, right? Okay. At the end of February, or the middle of February, February 18th, the Mercury retrograde goes back into Aquarius. Okay, so it's going to start out in Pisces, go into Aquarius, where Pluto is where the North Node is. So I think that that is going to review some themes regarding the Aquarian energy, right? I think there's going to be huge conversations as we're moving into this new incarnation cross, mind you, on the 23rd, so just days after this. Technology, is this benefiting us? I think that's going to be another hot topic as we keep going here. A review of like how our thoughts are creating reality, how we are all interconnected with our thoughts. This could bring up themes as well about huge disparities of wealth, okay? Because the Leo Aquarius opposition is kind of about the haves and the have-nots. I think, again, we're going to be reviewing like, hey guys, where do we need to redistribute some power? Where do we need to redistribute some wealth? And then again, Mars retrograde in Virgo along with this, there might be new details that emerge. There might be, it just seems like there's so many things that need to be corrected. We could feel slightly overwhelmed, but remember, that's also going to be part of the old incarnation cross dying out, which is very loud. The dying of the cross of planning and everything that came with that. February is going to be quite a powerful month, just like it was this month. Okay, days later, February 21st, so this is just 2 days before the incarnation cross change. Mars retrograde, that started in Virgo, goes into Leo. So now we have Mars retrograde in Leo along with Jupiter, along with the South Node. Okay, so again, this is going to amplify the Leo Aquarius axis. Who has what? Who has access to what? Disparities of wealth, disparities of power, massive ego checks. Volatile time of year. We will dive into February as we get closer, but this is some volatile stuff. Then the incarnation cross changes on February 23rd. Okay, now we get to the 3-3 portal, March 3rd. Mercury goes direct in Aquarius. So at least we have that. So at least March, we start to become more focused on what are we going to do as collectives, as small groups? How are we going to come together to change the future, right? March 18th, Mercury will then re-enter Pisces. So again, we have an extended period of time, again, with Mercury in Pisces. I don't know. I don't have much else to say about that. But anyway, April 1st, April Fool's Day, Mars goes direct in Leo. Okay. So all of a sudden, April, the momentum starts happening. January, February, March, somewhat of a strange time. January, actually, I'm okay with that astrology. Mars retrograde in Virgo. I think we could work well with that, but January is okay. February and March, very, very dicey here, but April 1st, the momentum starts moving. We have Mercury direct in Aquarius. We will have Mars direct in Leo. So there will be lots of oppositions again between Leo and Aquarius. Okay. Now we jump to May 14th. I know we're jumping a little bit, but May 14th, Mars will re-enter Virgo. Okay. July 15th, Mars enters Libra. Okay, so just to recap that, Mars is going to enter Virgo originally on November 25th of this year. And it's not going to leave, well, it's going to go retrograde again, right, into Leo, right? Then it goes direct, but it'll technically not end its Mars in Virgo cycle until July of next year. So that's December, January, February, March, April, May, June, July. 8 months where Mars will be back and forth in Virgo. And again, hindsight's always 20/20, and this is why I have been speaking so much about the fact that just because one transit ends doesn't mean the story is over. One transit always prepares us for the next. So again, my example with Uranus and Taurus, it was 7 years of just constant instability. I mean, between housing and food and inflation and the stock market and the economy. It just never ended. And I know we were all, I'm super happy about Uranus and Gemini. I have Mars in Gemini, so I'm quite enjoying that transit. But it doesn't mean that the story of Taurus is over, because we have Chiron entering Taurus next year and we have Saturn entering in 2028. Okay. And I've been saying this about the nodes. The nodes, yes, are now in Aquarius and Leo. And there's going to be so much pressure on that axis, to be honest with you. I mean, it's just so much pressure because Pluto's in Aquarius as well, and because Jupiter's in Leo. And then, as you can see with these retrogrades, right, we will have Mars retrograde dip into Leo. We will have the Mercury retrograde next February dip into Aquarius from Pisces. So there's this huge pressure on this Leo Aquarius axis. And we all thought, like, listen, I was never so excited for Neptune to exit Pisces. I just was so over that 16-year transit. And Neptune briefly went into Aries in the summer of 2025 for like 4 months. We started to get the preview. We started to have the energy come in. And then, of course, February of 2026, Neptune officially entered Aries. And it was like, oh yes, we're like done with this. But no, we still have the North Node in Pisces. Lingering, right? We still have a final Pisces eclipse in August of 2026. So the story of Pisces is not over. And now what I'm seeing with this astrology here is that the South Node in Virgo, her story is not complete, because now we're going to have 8 months of Mars back and forth in Virgo. That is insane. And of course, another Mercury retrograde in Pisces. So the Pisces Virgo axis story isn't done. So what is very interesting to me is that, of course, in 2027, the 4 major players of the game are going to be Aquarius and Leo and Pisces and Virgo. And so so Pisces and Virgo is all about the health and wellness axis. Pisces is our spiritual wellness. Okay. It is about how we surrender to life, how we understand reality from a higher dimensional state, how we transcend duality. Okay, and Virgo is about understanding the details, how things actually work, how to correct things, how to have discernment, and also how to take care of ourselves physically, right? These are important aspects of this ascension process. And then you've got Aquarius and Leo. The axis of the me versus the we. Okay, the axis of individuality versus the collective, of creative expression and being seen versus, right, maybe going against the grain and not really being celebrated, but following the right frequency. So it's all about creative alignment, collective collaboration, and also, independent or self-autonomy, self-authority. And this is very interesting because it completely makes sense when looking at the cross of the sleeping phoenix. It's all about that. It's all about how we take care of ourselves moving forward. And so it just seems like we're beginning that process here in the fall. Like we've had 7-8, we're going to have 7-8 months of the year where we are bang, 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 planting seeds, moving new energy. But we don't even really know what that means. We don't know. We have begun the activation. We've begun planting the seeds. The energy is moving. But clearly, starting in the fall, we have to get ourselves integrated to this new frequency. We have to prepare ourselves for stepping into what's going to unfold from these seeds. So that is your retrograde update. I know it's a lot to take in, but this is going to be quite a ride. We will cover everything as we get to it. But yeah, love you guys. It's going to be a wild ride, but let's focus first on the fall of 2026 and preparing ourselves for that. And we will talk about that after we get through the eclipse season of August.